When you think of the Middle Ages, you might picture brave knights in shiny armor, beautiful castles, and romantic tales of chivalry. But if you were actually transported back to medieval times, you'd quickly realize that life was far more brutal than the stories let on. The reality? It was dirty, dangerous, and short. You might think you're tough enough to survive just about anything, but trust me, after just 24 hours in this brutal reality, you'd be praying for a way back to modern times. In this video, I'm going to take you through the detailed reality of medieval life and show why you wouldn't survive a single day in the Dark Ages. Imagine stepping into a bustling market in 14th century England. You're surrounded by people shouting over each other, bartering for food and goods, and because you are hungry, you take the chance to order a loaf of bread. Simple enough, right? Except you can't understand anyone. The peasants are speaking in a strange version of English that sounds more like gibberish. The upper class is chatting away in French, and the priests? Latin only? Thank you very much. It's like walking into a grocery store today, but nobody speaks your language, and your debit card is a pile of turnips. Good luck buying that bread. Oh, and while you're trying to figure out how to survive, let's hope you aren't a woman. Society back then placed heavy emphasis on biblical teachings that cast women as weak and subordinate. If you weren't in a convent, you were likely married. Take Marjorie Kempe, for example, a real medieval woman who left behind one of the first autobiographies in English. She was a wife, a mother, and at one point, she had 14 children. Childbirth back then, about as dangerous as skydiving with a napkin for a parachute. 1 in 5 women didn't make it out of childbirth alive. So, if Marjorie had some complaints, I don't blame her. As if that wasn't enough, the general dangers of daily life were compounded for everyone, especially children. The odds were stacked against the youngest members of society from the very beginning. In medieval England, nearly 1/3 of children didn't make it to their 5th birthday, and diseases like measles, whooping cough, and dysentery were rampant. Medicine as we know it today didn't exist. In fact, many people relied on bizarre remedies that ranged from the ineffective to the outright dangerous. Even water was often contaminated, and malnutrition was common, making the average medieval childhood a roller coaster of health crises and uncertainty. But say you made it through those first few years, your next battle was with your place in society. Most people were peasants, tied to the land. Day in and day out, you worked the fields, not just to feed your own family, but to pay your lord's dues. You couldn't even marry without the lord's permission, and every harvest was a gamble. Too much rain or not enough meant the difference between a feast or famine. Unfortunately, hunting to fill the gaps wasn't an option either. That was strictly reserved for the nobility. Try poaching, and you could be put to death. And the law? Well, the justice system of the Middle Ages wasn't exactly fair. Petty crimes could result in brutal punishments that seem shocking today. For example, theft could land you in the gallows or worse, while a more serious accusation might lead to a trial by ordeal, forced to hold a red-hot iron or plunge your hand into boiling water. If you healed well, you were innocent. If you didn't, you were guilty, and the punishment could be even more severe. Also, the medieval legal system was further complicated by the influence of the church. Ecclesiastical courts dealt with moral and religious offenses, often offering leniency compared to secular courts. This dual system created a confusing legal landscape, where a noble could evade harsh penalties through the power of their status, while peasants faced the full brunt of the law. But as if the threat of punishment weren't enough, war was constant. Conflicts were everywhere. Over 370 major wars occurred during the Middle Ages alone. These ranged from power struggles among nobles and disputes over thrones to religious crusades aiming to reclaim holy lands. For the average peasant, war was a fact of life, and you had 2 choices: fight on the front lines or remain behind to protect your village from marauding armies. Now, what would war be like for the average soldier? Unlike the noble knights depicted in romantic tales, most soldiers were peasants pressed into service. When war broke out, They were often conscripted by their local lord or rallied to fight in the name of their king. You would have little choice in the matter, and your training would likely be minimal, perhaps a few days of instruction with a sword or spear. On the battlefield, soldiers faced overwhelming odds. Armies often clashed in brutal, chaotic engagements where formations could dissolve into chaotic melee. If you were lucky, you might have a shield and a spear. If you weren't, you might wield a simple farming tool. All this resulted in one thing: the brutal and often gruesome deaths of those involved. In fact, many soldiers died not from battle wounds, but from diseases like dysentery or infections, which were exacerbated by the filthy conditions of war camps. Okay, but what if you would get a better starting point? As someone wealthy, you might think you had made it, but even the rich couldn't escape the dangers of medieval life. Let's say you're a noble enjoying a feast. Fancy, right? Except your food might be deadly. Lead poisoning from glazed pottery was common. And then there was ergot, a fungus that grew on rye bread and could cause hallucinations or death. Imagine thinking you're just having a nice medieval dinner, and suddenly it feels like you've ingested a bad mushroom from a video game. Not exactly the five-star dining experience you'd expect. Daily life in medieval times was already perilous, but in the mid-1300s, things took a darker turn with the arrival of the Black Death. As the disease spread rapidly, with reports indicating that it could travel from one town to another in mere days, people were gripped by panic and confusion. Little was known about the disease, and theories about its origins ran rampant. While some believed it was punishment from God for humanity's sins, others attributed it to foul air, or miasma, an invisible poison that seeped from the earth. The idea that witchcraft was involved also gained traction, leading to an unfortunate surge in witch hunts, as people sought scapegoats for their suffering. Interestingly, the Black Death had a variety of symptoms that could manifest within just a few days after infection. Victims would often develop painful swellings, known as buboes, which could appear in the groin, armpit, or neck. Other symptoms included fever, chills, and extreme fatigue, often followed by delirium. On top of that, the speed at which the disease could take a life was horrifying. Many died within 24 hours of showing symptoms. In the end, the Black Death swept through Europe from 1347 to 1351, killing an estimated 25 million people, nearly a third of the continent's population. Of course, amidst all the chaos, some people did manage to carve out a life, but overall, it's pretty clear that life in the Middle Ages was far from the romanticized tales of chivalry and honor we've grown accustomed to. For most, it was a constant struggle against disease, starvation, violence, and death. Okay, thank you for watching. By the way, this is my first video, so a quick like and subscribe would mean a lot. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to drop any feedback or suggestions for future content in the comments below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.